So with that, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Mr. Earling, I will turn the stage over to you. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause to welcome them.
Well, thank you, DJ. I'm really looking forward to this panel. I think one of the strengths that DJ and the State of Reform Conference have been able to achieve is bringing together a diverse range of relevant voices for every given year that can really lend some unique perspective and provide value for this conference. And given the election results, both for federal implications and at the state level, I think having Slade and Rob will be tremendously useful. And I'm looking forward to the fact that neither of them is currently in elected office, therefore much more free to give candid opinions. So that should make things a lot more interesting. So I actually want to kick it off with a question to kind of level set, because all of us in the room care a lot about healthcare. That's why we're here. But the elected officials and policymakers are going to have a lot on their plates besides healthcare, even though it's a really important issue. So just as kind of a grounder, I'm hoping maybe Slade on the federal side and Rob on the state side give us some perspective on, maybe not on a comprehensive list, but what are a few issues that are going to be more important than healthcare to policymakers in DC and Olympia? Rob, if you want to start.
Well, at the state level, the 2015 legislative session is going to be all about education. Also, it'll be all about education and also education. K-12, higher ed, and early learning will all be high on the radar screen. The legislature must come up with a plan to comply with the Supreme Court's order in the McCleary case. And I think they will come up with a plan, but it will be very difficult. It will consume much of their intellectual energy and political capital, and I think that will be the main accomplishment of the legislature. There'll be lots of talk about other issues, ranging from transportation to carbon taxes to other issues, but it'll take everything they've got to pull off a solution to McCleary, I think.
Slade, on the federal side.
At the federal level, the first major bill that is almost certain to go through Congress will be the authorization of the XL pipeline. And energy is a major issue of conflict between the new Republican majority in Congress and the president. Tax reform, on the other hand, is a field in which some real progress is clearly possible, and it will take a lot of time. The budget resolution, healthcare is very much involved in that, of course. Healthcare, on the other hand, is already the subject of the first bill that has passed either house of Congress. Not a major bill, but it's on healthcare, and it passed 412 to nothing. So there'll be plenty of action on healthcare in Congress, some of it highly conflicting and some of it cooperative.
Great. I think that's helpful grounding. One of the things that Slade, if you've heard him talk before and giving advice on how to talk to, especially policymakers and elected officials, we'll talk about the value of presenting information to them that's relevant from their perspective. And so having that grounding that, hey, we all think healthcare is really important, but these guys have a lot of other things on their plates as they're trying to grapple with these issues. Speaking of issues, especially at the federal level, there's a little Supreme Court case coming up later this spring that could have a major impact on the Affordable Care Act. I'm going to ask you to both read into your crystal balls and predict how is the court going to rule on that case, and what will be the response of the Republican majority in Congress to that ruling. Easy question.
No one predicted accurately how the first big test of Obamacare would come out, what the Chief Justice was going to do by any means. In this particular case, on whether or not states without their own exchanges can be subsidized, the statute's pretty clear that they can't be, that there's a distinction between the two. But that is not to say that it is safe to predict that that's the way the court will come out. The court, taken as a whole, the last time around, simply decided this was such a large issue that it really oughtn't to be decided by the courts, but through the regular political process. And that's clearly a possibility this time around as well. What the reaction will be on the part of a majority in Congress, of course, depends on which way the court goes. I think I can say in general, with respect to Republicans and health care, my party has now captured a majority in Congress. It's sort of like a dog that's been chasing a truck down the road. Now it's caught up with the truck, and it's got to figure out what to do with it. And we'll see how that turns out. But it's very, very difficult to predict. The House will repeal Obamacare, as it has before, pass a bill repealing Obamacare. There's a very real possibility it will make the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. That is to say that a significant number of Democrats will vote for that repeal as well. The president will veto any repeal, and his veto will almost certainly be upheld. I have some understanding that Senator McConnell would just as soon that it didn't even get to the president in the first place, and that it'd be off their agenda for a while. But that'll be probably the first big issue with respect to health care taken up, and its result will have an immense effect on what goes on thereafter.
Slade, you mentioned Senator McConnell. I think we want to get back to that topic in a minute. I think there's more to explore there. But Rob, what about the Supreme Court case? What do you think?
Well, I agree that it's very difficult to predict what their ruling will be. I think also, though, that you can gauge how they'll approach the ruling based on the way the Chief Justice has managed cases to date. He prefers narrow rulings. When he can get a larger majority, he'll try to put one together. But on this issue, I think he'll probably resign himself to a 5-4 majority because this is such a polarizing issue. Nevertheless, if it is 5-4, I think that it will be decided on more conventional grounds than the very creative grounds that the Chief Justice manufactured in the original ACA ruling. So if the language is plain and seems to support the subsidy, then it would seem to me that Chief Justice would go that direction and not be creative to find a way around it.
Okay. So one issue I want to explore is the issue of the Senate, given that it changed hands at the federal level. And there's a corollary between those of us that work with the State House of Representatives here in Washington. Frank Chop runs the State House pretty clearly. And in a pretty similar vein, the majority leader in the US Senate has a lot of say over what happens there. So Slade, tell us, what's Mitch McConnell thinking? You alluded to the fact he may not actually want to see a 60-vote
I think
threshold.
there's a very real distinction between those two. It is true that Frank Chop has run the State House of Representatives. The majority leader in the Senate does not have the same authority that the Speaker has in the House. The majority leader can bring up a subject, but he can't control the outcome of a subject. First, because of the rules with respect to unlimited debate, and secondly, because United States senators, very bluntly, are more independent of their party organizations than state representatives are. Senator McConnell has the issues I've already spoken to ahead of him. He will want to see to it that there's a major debate on energy policy. He will want to see to it that there's a major debate on tax policy. He'll want to see to it that there's a major debate on the whole direction of the budget and the like. He'll probably want to see that, and there'll probably be major debates on foreign policy, on terrorism, on cybersecurity, for example. Now, some of those accord themselves well to a bipartisan approach. Others do not. His party will demand that there be debates not just on those that can reach solutions, but even on those that cannot. So he can bring up a bill. Frank Chop can bring up a bill. Frank Chop can probably get his bills passed. Senator McConnell, far more questionable.
That's great. So, following up on that, Senator McConnell has some things he would like to see, perhaps, in terms of how the ACA may or may not come up on the floor of the US Senate. Are there significant differences with members of his own caucus in what they would like to see and might try and inject into the US Senate?
Yes, there are, because, having caught that truck, the dogs, or the group of dogs, now have got to decide what direction they want to go in, and there are many. Probably, it may very well be that the single leading Republican on the health care issue may not be a senator at all, but maybe Congressman Ryan in the House, who has spent a great deal of time thinking about it, who has a number of solutions, some of which don't look all that dissimilar from many of the major elements of Obamacare itself. And it's far more likely that a bill with a major bill with respect to health care will originate in the House, will get through the House before it gets through the Senate, and the senators will have to react to it.
So we spent some time on federal policy. Let's dive a little bit into state policy. There's been a fair amount of talk in a number of different angles on potentially consolidating or changing the way state government is structured in a number of respects related to healthcare. And you've got this alphabet soup right now of the OIC and WABI and DOH and LNI and HCA. There's been proposals to change the structure of the exchange. There's been proposals bandied about at times to make certain offices reporting to the governor rather than independent elected officials. Rob, what's the best choice for state government right now in terms of providing accountability in healthcare policy and implementation?
Well, I think that it is possible that you could see restructuring, at least in principle. The legislature adopted a significant restructuring in the last few years of Governor Gregoire's administration when it created the Department of Enterprise Services and consolidated a number of smaller agencies together, and I think did so pretty effectively and with an eye towards increasing accountability. So, over time, you will sometimes see moves to rearrange the boxes on the organization chart and to try to increase efficiency. These issues, though, with healthcare are a lot more difficult and more controversial, and also are likely to be complicated by the tensions between the governor and the legislature. In a word, I don't think that the Senate Republicans are going to be interested in giving the governor more power by, for example, putting OIC under the governor as a direct report. At the same time, the Democrats will be unlikely to support significant changes to the HCA or HBE if they think the exchange would somehow be weakened by that. Now, I could be wrong if enough Democrats have concluded they don't like the way the exchange is operating and they think it would be better to put it under the direct authority of the governor or in some other mechanism. But given the complications of inter-branch relationships, executive, legislative, and given the point I made earlier about the difficulty of meeting the McCleary challenge, I doubt they're going to spend a lot of energy on a complicated restructuring about a topic as controversial as healthcare.
So let's build off that for a second, because it seems, based on what you've both described, that Governor Inslee in particular has a lot of challenges on his plate. He's got a legislature that doesn't entirely agree with him. He's got a lot of things he wants to accomplish. He's got the McCleary issue to tackle. Both of you have quite a bit of experience in state government. What advice would you give Governor Inslee, just as an elected official trying to navigate these challenges? Slade?
Take a clear position. Be willing to talk not just only to his own side, but to the other side in the legislature. Attempt to show some real leadership.
And that means that the governor has to be able to work more effectively with the legislature. Legislators from both sides of the aisle in the last two sessions have expressed a lot of frustration that the governor has not stepped in a sufficiently constructive way to help bring the sides together and negotiate agreement, negotiate compromise, which is necessary when you have one party effectively controlling one chamber and the other party controlling the other chamber. Governor Gregoire developed a reputation of being able to do that towards the end of session, bringing disparate interests together, sitting them down at the table for as long as it took to get them to reach an agreement so that the legislature and the governor could complete their work for that session. Governor Inslee thus far has not demonstrated the same ability. He needs to develop it if he wants to be more effective in advancing the state's purpose, but also in advancing his own agenda. His ability to do that is complicated by the fact that Speaker Chop does not have the same majority that he had prior to last November's election. His majority has shrunk considerably, and that means that he is less likely to bring up votes that he thinks will be problematic for the more moderate members of his caucus who represent districts that are not deep blue. In the past, he's had the luxury of allowing representatives from such districts to simply not vote for a controversial measure, to vote the other way or not to vote. He can let them off because he's had enough votes to get the bill passed anyway. Now, with that much narrower majority, it's much harder for him to do that. And therefore, he is less likely to bring up bills that put his members that are in more of a swing district at risk. And the solution when you face that is you just don't allow things to come up for a vote. Whereas in the past, he might bring things up for vote even if he knew they wouldn't pass the Senate, because he also has to satisfy his base by showing that they're doing something on the issue of the day. And having a vote, even if it's not ultimately passed through the full legislature, is one way to do that. It just isn't going to be as easy for him to do that going forward.
Several of my Republican legislative friends are telling me how much they miss Crispin Gregoire. Something they never thought they would say just a few years ago.
So what about President Obama then? And I ask in particular because the track record of presidents in the last 2 years of their second term in recent memory is not really great, especially in terms of political popularity and overall legislative success. So what advice might you offer the president as he attempts to navigate what could be a challenging couple years?
The president is in a very different situation than the governor. The governor will obviously run for re-election. He's not a lame duck. The president is a lame duck by the Constitution. This is his last 2 years in office. And while the jury is still out on that question, the president really has to decide whether he wants his legacy to consist of tangible accomplishments, which means that he's got to reach out and compromise, or whether his legacy is going to be he stood for certain principles come hell or high water, whether or not they can pass. He has given some indications in both directions. Unfortunately, more of them, I think, in the latter than the former. To digress just a little bit, personally, I think that the worst thing that happened to President Obama was getting 60 Democratic United States senators when he was first elected, so that when he started in that dramatic first year, he did not have to compromise. He did not have to pay any attention to the minority party. Well, of course, he lost that ability after 2 years, and it's been very difficult for him to shift direction. I still have some real hopes that he will decide that he wants to point back to very real and very tangible accomplishments, and that he's going to be willing to meet the Speaker and Senator McConnell halfway on a fairly wide range of issues. But that's his decision. No one else can make that for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is his decision, and he faces a very practical and serious challenge. And the Republicans in Congress face a very serious and practical challenge, too, when it comes to the ACA. On the president's side, the challenge is that if he refuses to compromise at all, if he vetoes just about everything that comes across his desk that would reform or revise the ACA, then he is going to effectively allow pressure to continue to build on the Republican side to simply repeal it outright. That's not a big problem if his party continues to hold the White House after the 2016 election. it is a big problem if the White House changes hands. Because if it changes hands and that pressure has been allowed to build up and this issue is as polarizing in January of 2017 as it is today, his primary accomplishment as president, his legacy, Obamacare, faces a much higher risk of simply being repealed outright. The practical difficulty for Republicans is that if they do move forward and repeal Obamacare, they're going to throw a lot of people off of coverage that they now have under Obamacare. And that puts them in a very difficult position. That's why when you look at, for example, the Patient Care Act from the Senate, the Coburn-Burr-Hatch bill that was introduced in early 2014 or late 2013, which is many view as the most well thought out and maybe the most sensible approach to revising Obamacare. That's why you see them in that bill, those senators, trying to keep people in coverage by changing the mechanism of providing that coverage, but doing that by providing everyone who needs one with a subsidy to get insurance, but not simply pulling the plug on the patient, if you will, and killing it off outright. They realize that doing that is really fraught. So it seems to me that those practical challenges that are very serious for the Republicans and very serious for the president ought to be a reason for them to get together. For the president, it would mean agreeing to revising the most unpopular portions, the most unpopular features of the ACA in order to reduce the pressure to repeal it outright. It's like a series of small earthquakes which release the tectonic plate pressure is better than one big earthquake. And on the Republican side, it makes sense for them to move more incrementally because they don't want to give their opponents the ammunition to say, well, you threw 10 million people who finally had coverage under Obamacare off that coverage, and now they're no longer insured.
And that's that's the dilemma. Because the little changes, the relatively minor changes that may be made in a compromise are almost all going to lift fiscal pressure from people who are subject to it now. Either the insured, but more significantly employers and the like. Each of those will add to the pressure on the taxpayers as a whole, still running a huge deficit. And so Obamacare, the ACA, is enough of a reality so that in a real sense it can't be repealed. It's created so many interest groups and so many beneficiaries who will have to be taken care of with any change. That the situation even today, much less 2 years from now, is not identical to the situation that the president found when he started down the road in 2009.
So does that mean that for the future, we can expect that the notion of trying to achieve, if not universal coverage, at least a significant reduction in the uninsured is now enshrined as part of federal policy moving forward?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is too. It could have been accomplished more simply by expanding Medicaid, just doing that, and perhaps some sort of exchange program as well. But I agree that I think most people agree that it is better to have people covered than not covered.
So there you have it, two Republican voices saying the ACA is pretty much here to stay. It's just a question of what it looks like, which is a significant debate in and of itself. Is there an issue related to the ACA that isn't getting enough attention, that's important, that's a little bit below the radar screen right now, that's actually having an impact, that's going to get more attention in the future that we're not paying?
Do you mean a non-health care issue or any issue?
Yeah, sure.
Federally, what do you think? National security? What would it be?
Well, national security certainly falls into that category, and we just had a dramatic illustration of that in France yesterday. As you know, I served on the 9/11 Commission, and the situation is very different now from what we faced there. I think we have very likely prevented any future 9/11. One dramatic and tremendously destructive attack. But terrorism has been decentralized now, and it's much more likely to be like what we saw in Paris. And a number of a couple of incidents here in the United States and others that have been prevented. But as dramatic as those incidents are, the threat of cybersecurity and cyber terrorism is the great new event, something we didn't even consider in the 9/11 Commission because it didn't exist then.
Right. At the state level,
sure.
The two issues that are paramount and really rank far above healthcare as an issue for legislators and for voters are education and transportation. Stuart Elway released a pre-legislative session poll this week that shows that for Washington voters, education is now edged ahead of the economy as their #1 concern. That's not surprising because most of the voters live in the parts of the state that have really seen an economic upturn, the Seattle metro area. But it's very significant that voters are now saying education is their #1 concern. That doesn't mean McCleary is their #1 concern. It is a concern about the quality of education for their kids. So the legislature faces not only significant fiscal challenges when it comes to K-12. For example, they have to shift the cost of basic education back from the school districts onto the state budget. They've been doing the opposite now for 30 years, and the courts finally called them on it. You cannot fund basic education with local school levies, and that's exactly what the legislature's been forcing the districts to do for the last 3 decades. It's also about getting better results for the money we spent, increasing the graduation rate, increasing how well the kids are doing in school and how well prepared they are for the workforce when they graduate from school. Transportation is a big issue that actually ties to the economy. Transportation is an issue that voters really understand. I often say that every voter is an expert on transportation. You're all experts. I learned that when I chaired the Transportation Committee at the King County Council for several years, and it is a very big concern to people. It affects the quality of their life. They understand intuitively that it affects the economy. And even if it doesn't poll as high as the economy or education or a couple of other issues, for legislators, transportation is a huge issue because they know a lot more about the state transportation system, of course. They study it, and they realize we're in serious trouble. We're not just stuck with Bertha, or maybe Bertha's stuck on us. We also have an aging infrastructure system which is increasingly inadequate and requires major, very expensive investments. So they have to be able to come together, put together a package that will probably have to be based on the gas tax again in order to move forward on that. And that also will take up a lot of their time and energy that therefore will not be available for issues like complex changes to how we do healthcare in this state.
So Rob's entirely right. It's too bad he's not in charge.
So let me take that a step further, building on what you were saying, Rob. Does that mean the state exchanges are here to stay, particularly in Washington State?
I think it is. I think that I don't hear a lot of concerns about the exchange per se. I mean, there are concerns about implementing exchanges. Oregon and Maryland, for example, haven't had the best experience along with other states. But in Washington State, we have an exchange that seems to be working fairly well. And it just seems sort of like common sense to provide an opportunity for people to come in that structure, we're using that mechanism to get coverage and to then apply a subsidy to that coverage. So I do think it's around, barring some significant change to the way that the markets are working right now, or barring some significant change to the underlying federal law, I think it is here to stay.
So let me ask you a crystal ball question again. Without asking you to predict the actual nominees, since I think the last time everybody presumed Hillary would be the nominee for the Democratic Party, we got Barack Obama, and the Republican side will be a true scrum. Will either major party candidate in 2016 be running with health care as one of their top 3 issues?
Yes. Yes. This is not a debate that's going to be settled between this Congress and this president. There may, as Robert and I have both said, there may be some minor changes, but there isn't going to be a major philosophical change in direction. And no Republican candidate who has any chance of being nominated cannot have health care in the ACA as a major issue with whom he or she deals. Hillary may be a little bit more imprisoned, by having to stick with what's going on at the present time. But even she, I believe, will probably try to create some differences between herself and the president. But she's not going to advocate repeal by any stretch of the imagination. But health care will be an issue both for the Republican nomination and in the general election in 1916. 2016.
We're both 20th century guys, you understand. Look, the reason that another reason, and a couple of specific reasons that healthcare is going to be a big issue in the 2016 presidential campaign is what's happening in the experiences of everyday people with healthcare. What they're experiencing is dramatic increases in their costs. They're seeing very high increases in their deductibles, for example. Deductibles have gone up 52% from 2010 to 2015. That's a lot. The faculty at Harvard is launching a protest because their deductible went from $0 all the way up to $250. And they are outraged, I tell you, that their deductible is now $250, which of course is a direct consequence of the Affordable Care Act. It is, after all, an act which is focused to a significant extent on providing subsidies for the uninsured by creating a transfer from everybody who has been insured through higher deductibles, higher premiums, and so forth. People are noticing that. People are figuring out that they don't feel wealthier than they used to in many cases because their out-of-pocket expenses, whether for premiums or deductibles, are a lot higher than they used to be. And therefore, as a classic middle-class pocketbook issue, I think both candidates will be addressing it. They'll be addressing it in different ways, of course, but they'll have to address it. And addressing that cost is a way for the Democratic nominee to separate herself from the president, which of course they'll need to do.
And those forcing mechanisms will be toward reducing the extra costs for those people who are paying more now, which just simply puts a greater degree of pressure on the general budget, on our deficits, and on our huge national debt.
Concisely, any final words of wisdom for the audience?
You're not going to lose. You're not going to lose your jobs. There's going to be plenty for you to do and plenty for you to discuss at meetings like this for as far in the future as we can see.
Yeah, I agree. I think that job security is clear, and furthermore, that changes that we're going to see at the state level and at the federal level will be incremental. A key difference between the state and the federal level, of course, is that as Slade's prediction is borne out, that Congress scrambles to reduce the impacts on taxpayers, on ratepayers, by increasing the national debt and the deficit. At the state level, that can't happen. So to the extent that there's pressure to increase healthcare spending at the state, for example, for Medicaid, that's going to run right up against the fact the state doesn't run deficits and that the state has these other constitutionally mandated obligations for education that it has to meet.
I'm going to invite DJ to come back up because I think he'll have some closing comments before we allow you to scurry off and find those treasured seats for breakout sessions, since those are always a hot commodity. And while he strolls up, I want to take a point of personal privilege and wish Slade a very happy 87th birthday.
Thank you all, gentlemen. Let's just give him one more round of applause.